Though the long-running war between Iran and Iraq had ended in a United Nations brokered ceasefire in August 1988, by mid-1990 the two states had yet to begin negotiating a permanent peace treaty. When their foreign ministers met in Geneva that July, prospects for peace suddenly seemed bright, as it appeared that Iraqi leader Saddam Hussein was prepared to dissolve that conflict and return territory that his forces had long occupied. 2 weeks later, however, Hussein delivered a speech in which he accused neighboring nation Kuwait of siphoning crude oil from the Romania oil fields located along their common border. He insisted that Kuwait and Saudi Arabia and cancel out 30 billion of Iraq's foreign debt and accused them of conspiring to keep oil prices low in an effort to pander to Western oil buying nations. In addition to Hussein's incendiary speech, Iraq had begun amassing troops on Kuwait's border. Alarmed by these actions, President Hosni Mubarak of Egypt initiated negotiations between Iraq and Kuwait in an effort to avoid intervention by the United States or other powers from outside the Gulf region. Hussein broke off the negotiations after only 2 hours, and on August 2nd, 1990, ordered the invasion of Kuwait. Hussein's assumption that his fellow Arab states would stand by in the face of his invasion of Kuwait and not call in outside help to stop it proved to be a miscalculation. Two-thirds of the 21 members of the Arab League condemned Iraq's act of aggression, and Saudi Arabia's King Fahd, along with Kuwait's government in exile, turned to the United States and other members of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, commonly known as NATO for short. Now, U.S. President George H.W. Bush immediately condemned the invasion, as did the governments of Britain and the Soviet Union. On August 3rd, the United Nations Security Council called for Iraq to withdraw from Kuwait. 3 days later, King Fahd met with U.S. Secretary of Defense Richard Cheney to request U.S. military assistance. On August 8th, the day on which the Iraqi government formally annexed Kuwait, Hussein called it Iraq's 19th province. The first U.S. Air Force fighter planes began arriving in Saudi Arabia as part of a military buildup dubbed Operation Desert Shield. The planes were accompanied by troops sent by NATO allies, as well as Egypt and several other Arab nations, designed to guard against a possible Iraqi attack on Saudi Arabia. In Kuwait, Iraq increased its occupation forces to some 300,000 troops. In an effort to garner support from the Muslim world, Hussein declared a jihad, or holy war, against the coalition. He also attempted to ally himself with the Palestinian cause by offering to evacuate Kuwait in return for an Israeli withdrawal from the occupied territories. When these efforts failed, Hussein concluded a hasty peace with Iran so as to bring his army up to full strength. On November 29, 1990, the UN Security Council authorized the use of all means necessary of force against Iraq if it did not withdraw from Kuwait by the following January 15th. By January, the coalition forces prepared to face off against Iraq numbered some 750,000, including 540,000 U.S. personnel and smaller forces from Britain, France, Germany, the Soviet Union, Japan, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia, among other nations. Iraq, for its part, had the support of Jordan, another vulnerable neighbor, Algeria, the Sudan, Yemen, Tunisia, and the Palestinian Liberation Organization, commonly referred to as PLO. Early on the morning of January 17, 1991, a massive U.S.-led Air Force offensive hit Iraq's air defenses, moving swiftly onto its communication networks, weapon plants, oil refineries, and more. The coalition effort, known as Operation Desert Storm, benefited from the latest military technology, including stealth bombers, cruise missiles, so-called smart bombers, with laser guidance systems and infrared night bombing equipment. The Iraq Air Force was either destroyed early on or opted out of combat under the relentless attack, the objective of which was to win the war in the air and minimize combat on the ground as much as possible. By mid-February, the coalition forces had shifted the focus of their air attacks toward Iraqi ground forces in Kuwait and southern Iraq. A massive Allied offensive, Operation Desert Sabre, was launched on February 24th, with troops heading from northeastern Saudi Arabia into Kuwait and southern Iraq. Over the next 4 days, coalition forces encircled and defeated the Iraqis and liberated Kuwait. At the same time, U.S. forces stormed into Iraq some 120 miles west of Kuwait, attacking Iraq's armored reserves from the rear. The elite Iraqi Republican Guard mounted a defense south of al-Basar in southeastern Iraq, but most were defeated by February 27th. With Iraqi resistance nearing collapse, Bush declared a ceasefire on February 28th, ending the Persian Gulf War. According to the peace terms that Hussein subsequently accepted, Iraq would recognize Kuwait's sovereignty and get rid of all its weapons of mass destruction, including nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons. In all, an estimated 8,000 to 10,000 Iraqi forces were killed, in comparison to only 300 coalition troops. Now, though the Gulf War was recognized as a decisive victory for the coalition, Kuwait and Iraq suffered enormous damage, and Saddam Hussein was not forced from power. Intended by coalition leaders to be a limited war fought at minimum cost, it would have lingering effects for years to come, both in the Persian Gulf region and around the world. In the immediate aftermath of the war, Hussein's forces brutally suppressed uprisings by Kurds in the north of Iraq and Shiites. The United States-led coalition failed to support the uprisings, afraid that the Iraqi state would be dissolved if they succeeded. In the years that followed, U.S. and British aircrafts continued to patrol skies and mandate a no-fly zone over Iraq, while Iraqi authorities made every effort to frustrate the carrying out of the peace terms, especially United Nations weapons inspections. This resulted in a brief resumption of hostilities in 1998, after which Iraq steadfastly refused to admit weapons inspectors. In addition, Iraqi forces regularly exchanged fire with U.S. and British aircraft over the no-fly zone. In 2002, the United States, now led by President George W. Bush, son of the former president, sponsored a UN resolution calling for the return of weapons inspectors to Iraq. UN inspectors re-entered Iraq that November. Amid differences between Security Council members states over how well Iraq had complied with those inspections, the United States and Britain began amassing forces on Iraq's border. Bush, without further UN approval, issued an ultimatum on March 17, 2003, demanding that Saddam Hussein step down from power and leave Iraq within 48 hours. Under threat of war, Hussein refused, and the Second Persian Gulf War, more generally known as the Iraq War, began 3 days later. But that, my friends, is a story for another time.
That war probably shows that we are a keeper in the peace throughout the world as much as we can. And
Never did anything else that large in my life. At least I always had. I can say I was part of a large force that went in and helped free up people. So,
the camaraderie that the people that wear the uniform have is amazing. It helps you get through those hard times.
I'll never forget, I had a Iraqi soldier that came in who, when I approached the bedside, he was scared to death. He was like 17 years old. He had lost one eye and had an injured arm, and he was emaciated and lice-ridden, and you really realized, here, you know, you have this poor soldier who's not even given food and water and health care to serve and try and take up for his country. And you know, we live like queens and kings in the United States, so sometimes you have to go away to realize how fortunate you really are.
The United States will stand up for its allies against tyranny, and we've got their back, and we will be there to support them. And then when we've got it done, we will leave them in a better position than they were before we got there.
In both of those wars, we had an enemy that capitulated because of the show of force. But man, the soldiers we got now are just, man, we put those guys in those Humvees and they're going out every day seeing bad guys. And I mean, I think that's, you know, that's the big difference now is it's not a war where we're looking at an enemy who's going to capitulate because force is there. They just withdraw and they come right back at you, you know, one guy at a time. And it's really, you got to respect these young soldiers and airmen that we have today.
You know, I always heard stories of how when the Vietnam vets got back, they were really shunned and they weren't the most popular people on the planet. And that changed when I landed in Bangor, Maine. I walked down the terminal and, I mean, that terminal was packed. I mean, it was packed. It was packed with balloons, it was packed with people, and more people, and more people. And they treated you like rock stars, not that you wanted to be. And so I remember thinking, man, this is not like what I heard people coming back from Vietnam had to experience. So I think, you know, we showed that we will answer the call when it's needed, and we know that the Americans have our back. We have the world's back, and the Americans have our back.
I think we have to be a country that helps other people when they're oppressed. We have to be a country that's willing to stand up for human rights and stand up for a people to provide them a better way of life.